My very first thing, I'd like to thank our panel for making the time and taking the time to spend with us and talking about your experience on culture and mergers and acquisition. It's a really interesting topic, and what I would say is it's evolved and it continues to evolve in terms of the role that HR plays, and I think we're going to get a flavor for that from everybody here. So first of all, by means of quick introductions, we've got Crystal, who is from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, UPMC.
Yep.
So thank you for being there.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. And Robert, with Two Roads Hospitality, right? And did you all see his really cool title? Really cool people. Right. Head of really cool people. So there's a cultural element there that's obvious, which I think is fantastic. Yeah. And then Scott, would you like to?
No, I wouldn't. You have to be polite.
Yes, I am very polite. So Scott's with Easy, and so what they do is what would you say?
Subprime lending.
Subprime banking. Good. Okay, so it's a organization that has pawn shops and so forth. Okay. So anyway, get a little bit to know about the companies and their perspective. So again, we've got sort of representation across a number of different segments, and we'll talk about some experience first, really just logistically and understand a little bit about how mergers and acquisitions might work and the role of HR there at each of your organizations. So Crystal, would you mind telling us sort of what is the HR role in M&A activity, and what are some of those relationships that you have with other parts of the organization that have some accountability there as well?
Sure. I'll first start by just making sure you all understand what UPMC is. It's a $14 billion integrated healthcare medical organization. As a conglomerate of hospitals, we have 27 hospitals, about 68,000 employees, and we're growing. So we are acquiring hospitals. We've done about 5 already this year, and we have more scheduled. So our role in HR is really to conduct the due diligence, make sure we're looking at it from a cultural perspective, to collaborate with finance, IT, and anything having to do with systems to make sure that there is some synergy there around the impacts to our people. We also work in conjunction with the other HR folks in the acquired organizations to make sure people understand who's doing what are the contacts, how do you put together a project team. What are we doing around ensuring job mapping, job titles, benefits, systems, HR systems, PeopleSoft systems, and the types of HRIS systems? What are we going to use? What's the best type of system? So we get people together a lot. We have weekly calls for the several integrations that we're doing right now. Those calls are with our internal HR team and the acquiring internal HR team, and we do a lot of conversations around those things such as due diligence, contacts, communication, collaboration, and making sure that we're doing everything that we should be doing, considering people, anything touching people. So,
gotcha. So it's a very clearly defined sort of swim lane that you are in relative to the integration, to due diligence, all along the way at various phases.
All along the way, yeah.
Gotcha.
And there's so much involved with that, job mapping, job titles. The small organization has EVP titles, we don't, so who wins out? The CFO is called something different than our CFO, so what title is going to win out? Employment agreements, how do we work through the employment agreements that exist? Some of those are in place for 3 to 5 years, so when they come over, what happens? If someone is in an agreement with a certain title for 3 to 5 years, then that might mean they come over as a title that's more senior than the person they're going to be reporting to in the new organization. So there's just a lot of those weird, complex situations to deal with, and we struggle through those.
So you sort of field those things as they come up, and they might vary from deal to deal. Great. Robert, what would you say? How are you guys sort of structured and set up?
Yeah, so thanks for having us. We are the anti-brand brand in the hotel hospitality space. So in comparison to Hilton, Hyatt, Starwood, Marriott, companies where you see the name on the side of the building, shingles, we operate entirely unique hospitality and authenticity generated experiences. So when you come through our collection of assets and places and spaces where you live, work, play, and dine, our goal is to immerse you in the market in which you're experiencing that. So when you're in Phoenix, we want you to feel like you're in Phoenix. So by definition, we are a culture company cleverly disguised as a hotel hospitality organization. And so as we do mergers and acquisitions and find other hotels to become associated in our collection and manage, build, buy, develop, acquire, or in this past year, merge with a new organization and become larger, we have to think about that cultural, architectural role of HR and our leadership in helping to set the table and stage for 2 moves ahead in the chessboard. What is the end game of why we brought this organization, what we saw in the value creation principles? And so we really are business people first, disguised as HR folks. And so we use the term audacity of math. We want people to have the context of the why behind the what. Why did we do the acquisition? In the past year for us, we merged with a company called Commune Hotels and Resorts. The legacy organization Destination was known throughout the world as a resort-oriented company. Commune was known as an infill of spaces and places in San Francisco and New York, a collection of boutique, lifestyle, more urban-oriented experiences. So it was front and center for us to keep in mind why we did the acquisition in the first place. And so there was not only a physical footprint of new hotels and new locations, but a securitization of talent. And so as we think about HR's role in disrupting organizational structure and trying to capture why you did the acquisition in the first place, there's a huge linkage. To your point, Crystal, though, we connect the dots with our partnership in finance in very different ways. So in our HRIS system, HR uses terms like job families. And we joke that accountants don't have families, right? So people are looking at FTEs, or we look at heartbeats and butts and seats. And so do you mean Tim, or do you mean 0.2 of Tim? And so there's a different way of bringing, I think, pragmatism to the conversation that's more comprehensive. And HR, I think, plays a unique role in that dialogue.
Cool. So we are a PAWN broker, so that's the forerunner of banking and finance. We have about 5,000 employees. We operate in Canada, US, and Mexico. It is a Sunpride lender, and it's very much about a customer relationship. Easy Corp is the parent, and we have about 16 brands underneath that. Our growth and development has been through a lot of acquisitions, so we really know and understand the acquisitions. The role of HR is absolutely critical, because if you're really blunt about it, and Australians are really good at being blunt, that you're just buying people at the end of the day. You're buying people and a culture, and that's just bottom lining it. And all the finance people and all the strategy people can tell you that. But the critical issue is you are buying people. So HR's role in that, in understanding the people asset, how it's made up. So you do all the metrics. We have all the templates. We have teams together that we just put together as required in terms of making an acquisition. We in HR spend a lot of time assessing the culture of that company, what is the opportunity to blend the cultures together, and what is the capability of the people as well, and do we actually need more people, and how do we actually integrate that more effectively? So it's not just a question of that sort of black and white. Do the systems integrate? Do the metrics integrate? Do the job titles integrate? Does the culture actually integrate? Some of the experiences we've had is the fact that we have 16 brands is that they didn't do the integration process properly. So it was understanding that the customer identified with a different brand name. But at the end of the day, there's been no integration to actually move from that name. So in Florida, for example, it's Value Porn, and that's the company that we acquired. But we acquired that something like, I think, 8 or 9 years ago. And there's been no integration strategy of actually getting rid of that brand and moving it to the Easy Porn brand. So that's an example of where that actually hasn't worked. So the criticality of HR's role is to make sure those sorts of things actually happen. Assess the people really effectively, assess the culture, and then work on how it's going to integrate. Because otherwise it will be a complete disaster. The thing that's really important here is making sure that the rest of the due diligence team, and it'll be finance people, it'll be marketing, it'll be IT, it'll be strategy, they get that as well. So part of the role of HR is to explain that and educate them around that. So, because if they don't get it, either you're also sunk. So it is absolutely critical piece of the due diligence.
Cool. Michelle, can we get the handheld for Scott for the rest of the session? I think you're fading in and out. I don't want it to be a distraction. So now that we have sort of a sense, a lay of the land of how you relate sort of internally and some of that setup, what are some of the things that you all have put in place, maybe from a structure standpoint, some of the best sort of ideas that you've come up with in terms of readiness and preparedness, so that this isn't a reactionary proposition, that a target comes along and you find out about it one way or the other because you're involved or because it's sort of after the fact, So regardless of how that happens, it's really nice to be proactive and be prepared when something does come along. Do you have some things in place that you have found are smart, are good ideas that might facilitate that readiness?
Yeah, we're learning from our integrations. We're on our 9th or 10th, and we've been doing this for a while, but yet we seem to not have this repeatable process. So I think we've just brought someone on board who's doing kind of organizational performance, and she's really helping us with integration checklists and the weekly calls and putting together systems so that we can make this a scalable, repeatable process. We already have another 8 or 9 on the docket, so why not create a strategy that we can repeat? I think one important piece that we found, because we don't have an integrations team within HR or within our organization, we have people who have full-time jobs, and we add on top of that for them to work on integrations. It's a lot of work. So what we have found is that we have to teach people the skill set of the due diligence process or working on these project teams in a cross-collaborative way so that we're not pulling on the same people, because they'll get burnout. They're doing their full-time jobs and then they're working on an integration on top of that. And what we recognize is that we need to give other people an opportunity to do that. So whether or not they're some of our HR consultants or business partners, and they attend the weekly calls and gather information and come back to a larger group of HR, but we've recognized that we need to involve more people. I think we all have go-to people. They're our favorite folks that can help get projects done. We know they're results-oriented and they'll get things done. But we need to expand that, because oftentimes someone will say, Crystal's always working on the integrations, and then there's another VP of HR that's thinking, I'd like to get that experience. So one big piece for us is to make sure we're extending the folks extending our reach for the folks that are able to do that. But I think the integrations checklist, putting together a project team, understanding where people would like to participate has been good for us, and then ensuring that we have more people capable of doing due diligence are some of the things that we've put in place recently.
Yeah, because part of the processes, many of them are repeatable, right?
Absolutely.
And they're relatively predictable. Just sort of content in the target may shift the dialogue and some of the particulars as it comes to activities.
Yeah, we have the Expression View Culture Eats Strategy for Lunch, which is now a business book from the author Kurt Kaufman, who started the strengths-based positive psychology movement. Kurt happens to live in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, where we are, so he does some work with our organization. But there's a mirrored appreciation for that philosophy. And so one of our lessons, the application is culture should take a front row seat, because it makes everything else go a lot smoother when you have a common lingo and language along the way. 2, I think we would say a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And so if you're in HR, you have an opportunity to make more radical change you might otherwise have been wanting to make. And many of in the room here would probably frown at my next comment, which is I'm secretly hoping for some level of a downturn in the economy, because I think it'll give me a backdrop to do things that I've been hesitant or reluctant to do, because there's real people at the other end of those implications. And so while our business may suffer in the short term, I know it will create a backdrop for us to make more disruptive organizational change, which seems counterintuitive. So if you have an opportunity for a catalyst for organizational disruption and change, like a merger, it's a good opportunity to take advantage of things you might otherwise have been reluctant or slower paced to do. It gives you a backdrop and a conversation point. 3, for us, we've picked up different levels of talent and construct in that conversation. So we didn't have an internal communications, marketing, branding person in HR, what we call people services in our legacy organization. We had a super talented person, and that was a best practice from the new organization. And so we found a way to uncover best practices, next practices, and the secret sauce. And you can do that in lots of different crowdsourcing, formal, informal, technology-enabled workshops, but paying attention to those moments of truth that are on the front end that you don't get a chance to relive. It's like hiring a new executive in an organization. We're at the precipice of hiring a CMO for our organization, and the top candidates have all said, I don't want you to introduce me until I'm basically in the company for 30 days, because you will spoil my 30 days of people not knowing who I am, and I can get a real sense of what the organization is. I'm not sure we're going to go that far, but the principle applies, which is you only have a small window to get it right on the front end, and you need to be prepared and scalable against the critical few from the important many. And there are a critical few, and the more crystallized and coalesced your group is on the things that are going to make the biggest difference, I think is a lesson we would say we've learned.
Yeah, to Crystal's point, we have an integration plan, so it's sort of fairly well structured in terms of that process. The things that we've actually done is looking at due diligence as a professional development opportunity for any HR professional. So what we do is every 6 months we will actually put people through a professional development program which just looks at the due diligence process. So sometimes when we've done acquisitions, we've actually taken somebody along to actually just train them in the actual process. The other thing that we've found is that what's really important is that when you're training them, that you get them to go in with an open mind. I found when I started here 2.5 years ago, the approach was that the acquisition was made that we are in control, we are taking you over. And so what we've tried to change is that anybody on the acquisition team is actually open to listening and learning, because there may well be things within the other company that we could actually pick up and take back to our organisation, so that we don't just go in and take you over and then shut it all down. So that's a part of the training, is actually getting people to actually open their minds when they're going in. So they're getting into the data room, but they're asking the questions, so how do you actually do this, how do you do that, but not in a way that we're going to impose the system back, our system on you. And that, we found that really successful, and we've picked up some really good processes from some of the acquisitions that we've actually made. So that there are a couple of things that have proven to be really successful for us. I've gone again. Just as well this
going
isn't
in and out over there.
karaoke, you know what I mean?
Okay. So we're, again, I think what we wanted to do based on some feedback was ensure that we get some of your questions midstream instead of waiting till the end, so the dialogue and the conversation is a little bit more real time. So looking around the room, is there anybody who might have a question? Michelle's going to take the microphone around. If not, we can continue the conversation, but we'd love to engage you at some point along the way when you're ready. And so in lieu of, here we go. Did you have a question? No. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw somebody waving, trying to get the attention. So one of the other things that I think is really helpful is to learn about some of the lessons in a really practical sense. So if you can think back to one of the most recent mergers, acquisitions, due diligence process, integration process, anything that really leaps to mind as a good, solid example of a lesson learned, something that really went well, or something that was so disastrous that it proved to be really insightful and really helpful from you. So think of the last one, something that went well, something that didn't, but really proved an opportunity to learn, to build into continuing to grow this capability in the organization or even in the function from either of those aspects.
I think some of the things that we've learned are pretty simplistic around communication or even distribution lists. So you're trying to help your new integrated or acquired colleagues understand your organization. So learning the culture. We've talked a little bit about culture. We teach our culture through our values. Dignity and respect and integrity are two big ones out of the 5 that we have. And so we do a culture training. It's called Culture of Service Excellence. And understanding how to help people understand the way that work gets done in the new organization is important, but not being absent of being able to still be their authentic, let's just call them a mom and pop shop if they are. But we're acquiring hospitals, some are 3,500, some are senior living facilities of 80 people. So we want those senior living facilities of 80 people to still be able to live out and carry out their own values. So recognizing that we're acquiring an organization, but that they already have important values to them instilled, and understanding, to your point earlier, around learning from them, because there could be something wonderful that they're doing, and we just learned that from one of our acquisitions who has a wonderful performance management process. And they're doing something that we're not doing around feedback and kind of, we call it rounding with employees, but they're doing something wonderful in a small organization that we think we can implement in our larger organization. So understanding that, understanding values, and allowing people to be authentic to who they are while they're in the middle of an integration. And then another thing is just basic communication. So communication and distribution list. We've recognized that oftentimes someone, of course, is not immediately on a system, the new system, that system of choice for the larger organization, but they're on a distribution list so they can get information. So if you have links in that email that those folks don't have access to, you got to figure out how to get them that information. So we teach our HR folks, remember, such and such from XYZ hospitals on the distribution list now, so you have to make a way to get them the information by PDFing the documents that normally would be on the links. Or we've just created a who to contact list oftentimes we'll say, well, just contact your finance person. Well, people in a new organization don't know who their finance person is. So giving them a list of contacts of people to contact when they need something has been, proven to be successful. Again, these are very small and practical, but imagine spending 3 to 4 hours on a new website trying to figure out who's who. So giving someone a list of contacts saves them time and ultimately can affect and enhance productivity. So just little simple things we have found to be very helpful.
I think that's really important because those things may seem really straightforward and simple, and yet if we miss those things,
Exactly.
they're obvious indicators to the rest of the organization, whether it's the acquired company or even the new employees, about how buttoned up this whole process is, right? So we can't afford to fall short on those really simple, straightforward things. So I think those tasks are really smart.
Yeah, I think for us, one of our lessons is in the context of speed of trust, and we're going to have the Great Place to Work folks here later talking about their trust index and survey principles. But high trust organizations have very few policies, and low trust organizations can't have enough of them. And so you have to be clear about where you are going to focus for same, not similar, and where you are going to find points of differentiation from a policy or a pragmatic way to think about technology. We're talking at lunch about is it okay for a rogue place to have an ATS system that stays separate and distinct, or why do they need to be in one ecosystem? And so there are things around policies and context that have been in our lesson learned category. 2, for us, the culture formation is critical. So getting the right common definitions behind the language, behind the lingo, and a visual depiction of what we all mean when we say find your fun or be you, or bringing these values to life in a way that's playful and people can relate to has been helpful. The lesson for us on the downside, where I think we've missed it, is the Kenny Rogers song, "No one to hold 'em, no one to fold 'em, no one to walk away, no one to run." And I don't think we've always gotten that right. I think on balance, we've been too slow to pull the trigger. We've been hesitant or reluctant. There's been a miss on speed of application. Sometimes that's because of feelings, sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's we haven't thought through an exit onboarding plan or a retention strategy. I think we could have approached some of those decisions quicker and faster, and you got to get to as quick of a state of normalcy of this is how we're going to operate and work together as possible. So well-intentioned, and I think what I see a lot of companies do is put together a PMO office or a structured, expanded executive committee, and this executive team with this other group is going to meet for a period of time and get us through the transition, and you don't wind up transitioning to your normal state for 6 months, 9 months, a year. And people just don't feel like this is normal. And so the quicker you can get to normal, and I think most organizations have an opportunity to hit the accelerator and get there faster than they think they otherwise might. And I would just encourage speed.
For us, it's discipline to process. So you've got a process, but stick to it. It's absolutely critical, and that everybody's on the same page with that. And to the points about communication, absolutely critical. In both communication in terms of the due diligence team, but also to the company that you're actually acquiring. So a really good example is involved in an acquisition of a bank of about 5,000 people in Australia a few years ago. We only had 5 days to do the due diligence. But we didn't meet until, I think, day 3. And the lawyers were saying, we've confirmed that we're buying these legal entities of this bank because that's where the banking licenses were. And the importance of the communication is, and that's what they agreed with the other bank. And I said, well, that's going to be problematic because one of the other subsidiary companies actually is the employing entity, and that has 4,950 people of the 5,000. So you're not buying any of the people. So that was a classic example that they then had to go back and say, oh, well, we need this entity as well, and just looked a little bit silly in the entire process. So regular communication is absolutely critical. And the other thing is when you're communicating with the company that you're merging with or you're acquiring with, it is regular communication and do what you say. Don't be disingenuous in that communication. If you're not going to do it, don't say it. That's been my experience as well.
So we've heard a couple of times the word culture sort of thrown in and mixed in. So let's investigate this maybe a little bit more. And again, if you can think back to some real life experiences and think of a time when culture sort of rose up in a surprising way and either stopped or halted a process, whether it was very beginning of the process or you realized, late in the process around integration that there was a culture issue, and it created some maybe new challenges or halted the process altogether. Can you think of some times like that, and were there any aha moments that maybe you would have done something differently or considered some other things before progressing or moving ahead? So culture really is the topic, and how powerful can it be?
It's really powerful. I'm responsible for the international arm of UPMC. We do I'll call them joint ventures with other hospitals. So we help take healthcare to emerging markets, or we help build healthcare systems in other countries, Kazakhstan, Myanmar, China, and we currently are doing something we already have facilities in Ireland and Italy. And my 7:30 call this morning was with Ireland, and we're talking about performance management. And our performance management system at UPMC is around our values. And so we're getting ready to help Ireland, who's been acquired for 10 years, learn our values. So one of the biggest lessons learned around culture, because I'm talking to the country manager often about culture, is getting that done more quickly. You talked about speed, and not to leave someone alone. So we were having this conversation this morning around, well, how can we expect anyone to live the UPMC values, but we haven't taught them the values yet. So big lesson learned on not leaving an organization that you've acquired or that you're doing business with through a partnership alone, because if you leave them alone for a long time, they won't feel a part of the culture. And then when you start trying to throw little pieces of the culture to them, it doesn't feel good, it doesn't feel integrated. So to the extent that you can do that more quickly, I think it serves itself better when you're trying to implement people processes like performance management, or if you're trying to change behavior. And change management is another really big piece of this whole kind of integration activity.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in those moments, people are looking for the answer, right? People are looking to fill the vacuum. Is there going to be a change on this, or is there not going to be a change on this? And in most cases, people can tolerate it either way, but they just need
tell
to.
them.
I just need to know one
Yeah.
way or the other.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like an approach for situational leadership, right? At certain times, we need to be more highly directive, provide the information to people so they understand the new rules of the game. If that's the price of admission, it seems like a pretty small price
Absolutely.
for us to offer up for big results. Yeah. Robert, how about you?
Yeah, so to add to the 9-box, 4-box controversy, so we're a 9-box organization at present, probably moving toward a 4-box, but our current 9-box, our top right, we use playful, real language. So our top right box is Rockstar. Our bottom left box we call Promote to Customer. You'd be better organization. And so we have some real life context here, and when we go through the merger exercise, we break it down in a Survivor reality TV show context, which is, drop your buffs, we're merging. And just like when tribes merge, there's a new flag, there's a new ecosystem, sometimes there's a new name as some things change, and let's talk about what we want to preserve and why. And so there are accelerators around the culture that can help do that. One of our best practices, and we have a chance to speak often at events like Disrupt HR, and this is a pretty cool practice I hope some of you will find value in and potentially steal. So most organizations have a home office or corporate incentive plan. Most have some kind of field or property level location incentive plan. Very few organizations have something that is sticky and messy and matrix in between. And we find that one of the greatest competitive advantages we have against most every other, certainly hotel hospitality company, but most other companies, is we have incentive plans that are connected and messy and gooey that connect people at the local level to an organizational strategy. We just do it at a smaller proportion. So instead of having 100% of your incentive at a local level tied only to that local level, we put people on functional teams. So imagine this hotel was one of our hotels. The HR director at this hotel would have 90% of his or her incentive tied to this hotel. Instead of most of our competitors would say that was 100%. 10% of the HR director here at this location would be tied to some kind of a home office or corporate strategy or initiatives. And the way we set those initiatives is with the people here. So we call it, the inmates get a chance to run the asylum. So the group basically crowdsource their own agreed upon strategies at the beginning of the year. There's a home office liaison against 5 or 6 key initiatives that we agree to, fund, resource, and support. And we move 6 big blocks of initiatives forward each year in our organization. And we reward and incent and pay them accordingly. So every hotel like this hotel is comfortable with that because they get the benefit of the work of 5 other teams beyond just their HR director. So it's a huge win-win-win on the ecosystem, but it's messy, and it's a little bit more complicated. Where it's helped us on the M&A conversation is when you start to assimilate people to that kind of a culture that connects them to the organization mission and strategy immediately with a line of sight and actual compensation at risk and rewards at risk to get recognized, and you can think about the ecosystem play there. We found that to be a really powerful enabler. And we don't see a lot of other organizations mirroring that. And I think there's lots of ways for other companies and industries could mirror something like that and find value.
Yeah, we did an acquisition of about 10 stores in Arizona, and they didn't do, this is about 3 years ago, but they didn't do any sort of analysis of the culture. And what we found is that that culture was a highly communicative culture. But because the due diligence team didn't actually spend any time with the acquisition stores or even with the leadership of the stores explaining our culture and understanding their culture, they went and got the information from somebody else who was an ex-employee working for Cash America. So, and that information wasn't exactly correct. And then they discovered as they were going through the due diligence process that every single member of each of those stores was applying for jobs outside. And because they're wage level people, they've got options to go to Walmarts or hotels, hospitality, restaurants, whatever. And a number of them started to actually leave. So they pulled out of the acquisition because the asset that they needed was actually leaving. So it was a really good lesson of how you understand the culture, what are the principles of those cultures, and then adapt to that when you're going through the due diligence process.
Yeah, people are going to fill that vacuum, right? Whether it's with you, the official company line, or a former employee who may not exactly be privy to the right messaging, right? Yeah, that's a great example. How about some questions from folks in the audience here? Great. Maybe your name and the company you're from, please.
Melissa Deluxe. This is more of a tactical question more than anything. And by the way, awesome. People, not because of the two of you, but it's just a new way of seeing acquisitions, and I find it fascinating. How you guys do back office, the three of you, like examples, because I'm also with a company with 50 acquisitions, and integrating, making either shared services or back office or corporate office. How are you doing? How messy is that?
I mean, I'm responsible for corporate services. We find out how many people are coming into the benefits department, the comp department. Those folks still sit in the hospitals or cities that they're in. We're not asking anyone to move into Pittsburgh. They will continue to do the work and support the work that's being done, I guess, outside of the corporate headquarters, if you will. But they will start to integrate into, team meetings and team concepts and understand there are other people now that do what you do, and you can share best practices. But we don't disrupt that model much. We do have benefit service center, so we do have shared services and benefits and payroll. We do our own payroll. But the folks that sit in the hospitals that we're acquiring and do those functions, they're staying there. If they want to relocate to Pittsburgh, in some cases we're acquiring hospitals 4 hours away. We're not asking to disrupt families in different situations. If they want to relocate locally, they can. But in most cases, we're making them a part of our shared service center. They're still going to just stay where they are versus coming to kind of central headquarters, if you will. So it's not as messy in our situation. We're just finding out what's the head count of the folks coming in and integrating them accordingly.
Yeah, for us, I'd say we think about on the HR side, transactional versus transformational HR. So on the transactional side, everything's up for grabs. We're open to finding newer, better ways, insource, outsource, pushing. So some of that may come by way of an acquisition of a better way. And so we're open to harvesting that better way example about finding what's right with the other person and managing from their talents and their strengths. On the transformational side, we want to own that in-house. And so we've challenged some of the packaging of where those functions sit. So for example, in some organizations, the conversation around talent is a disparate one, with talent acquisition here and talent development here and culture and initiatives here. That may be the case for majority of the room here. We have a very different ecosystem set up where we call it the conversation of talent and the team member experience of a lifetime, where we package those reporting relationships and structure cradle to grave constructs here, and we own that transformational experience through integrated technology and platforms and systems here. So we use the bucket test to think about more disruptive back office innovation, and then it extends beyond HR. So we have a group in our organization called POG, POG, which is the Performance Optimization Group. They're sort of our R&D innovation experiment lab group, think tank, if you will, and they're the smart, geek squad version of our organization, analysts, and so they are kind of a neutral repository of ideation. So when we're going through underwriting, we use that group to help us, rethink or redesign or remap technology, systems, strategy, contract, process redesign. And so, we only keep a very few things that we want to keep as sacred because we know we want to own that, and then the rest becomes more of an open debate and discussion on a search for best next practice.
Yeah, for us, it depends on what is the acquisition or if you're doing a merger. So what is the size of that and how it's actually structured. And it's also making a very clear statement that you're not going to allow it to become a mess. So part of that is the actual communication process. So when we acquired our Mexican operations, where we have PeopleSoft in the US and Canada, we do not have that in Mexico. We have an interface between the two because that was the common sense approach. The other thing is you engage with the other side in that discussion process, and it's treating them with the respect that they actually deserve because you can learn from them, but also you get the right decision. And you get them engaged in the process and involved in the decision-making process.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Another question? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Felicia Smith with the John Templeton Foundation in Philadelphia. And Crystal, you said something that sort of sparked an interest in me because you were raving about this feedback process. You said rounding, I think is how you mentioned it. And so I wanted just to understand a little bit more about that. But also from a performance management perspective, if you're doing these acquisitions and these performance systems have been in place, maybe some a long time, and are reflective of that organization and what they value and all of that, how do you just say, okay, effective next January, you're all this? Do you try to integrate them? And this portion obviously is directed to all of you, but I think that's a really hard one to sort of get your arms around. And have you just thrown everything out and started from scratch? But then again, if you're doing lots of them, that's very hard to do. So
very hard
this
to
is a
do.
challenge for us, so I really want to hear how you've addressed that.
Yeah, so rounding is a medical term that kind of almost means, if you think about the old concept of management by walking around. So one of the hospitals that we acquired have just recently gotten rid of performance reviews, the process. They're doing more rounding, frequent conversations, becoming a feedback culture, and instead of doing a once-a-year process or the 6-month process where you have the formal conversation, they're having very frequent conversations about feedback, giving real-time feedback, so that there is no formal conversation that ever needs to be had. People know how they're doing all the time. That's not extremely innovative. We know a lot of organizations that have recently tossed their performance management or evaluation processes, but it is innovative for a small hospital. And so we've begun to have conversations around how can we build that feedback culture and do more rounding or teach our managers how to give constant feedback so that we're not relying on that once a year or 6-month process. Then your second question was about performance management. And yes, unfortunately, for our international locations, they were sent a form saying, hey, we're now going to have a consistent date instead of anniversary date for performance evaluations. And here's the new form. And what I recognized when I joined UPMC about 7 months ago was that there wasn't any training around. So now how do I understand how to measure myself against these new values that I didn't know of before? The other organization didn't necessarily have values, so values is new to the organization. So getting them training now on those values, but then recognizing that doing a simple form probably this year is going to be easier than just throwing out any process, and then kind of slowly integrating them into our values, understanding how to be measured and live those values and what those behaviors look like, so that they have a year to live them before they're measured on them. I think walking into an organization and throwing out a system probably is not the best way to do that. And we have 5 minutes, everyone.
Yeah, I would say for us, it's find a millennial. We want to think about the future as opposed to getting unstuck. So we looked at the past organizations we had, in this case, Commune Hotels and Resorts had what they call RFRT, real feedback, real time. They had already gone to this quarterly conversation discussion. On the legacy destination side, we had not. We had a pretty arcane, technology-driven process and system measuring different things, but it was a good opportunity to hit pause and rethink and redesign our practice. We had always wanted, and we were ambitious about moving toward a quarterly conversation, and we were concerned about how to migrate the change, but we used the backdrop of an M&A to be a catalyst for change. We call it F2F now, frequent feedback or face-to-face, and we took the best practices of this real feedback, real time construct that they had that was loosely coupled and not as tightly aligned and had some opportunity for practice. When we put literally like 40 millennials in a room and locked the door and bought them pizza and beer and said, come out and tell us how you want to get feedback. And I'm doing that a little bit draconian because that wasn't meant to be exclusionary to the rest of the workforce, but they tend to have better ideas, faster, quicker, more progressive, and are in line, and everybody else kind of got along. So we may have a traditionalist somewhere in the organization that liked the scoring and the rating system, but too bad, so sad. We're moving on. So yeah. I hope that they can get with us, and we're trying to solve to the. It's the 5-degree turn on the sprinkler head that makes a 45-degree difference on where the water goes on the lawn. And so sometimes these are not wholesale changes. They're small corrections or course corrections or giving it a language or a new look or packaging or marketing that adds context.
Yeah. For us, it comes as part of the template for due diligence and integration plan. So what happens there is that there'll be certain things that we'll look at that we would want to be non-negotiable, but it's through the communication process. So, for example, for one of the Mexican operations that we acquired, we wanted to apply our KPI settings because we had percentages at corporate level, percentages at business unit, and percentages at individual level. But the issue for the Mexicans is they said, well, how is the US parent actually going? Because if we've got 10%, I may lose 10% of my bonus. And, it's a valid question. So it's through the process of discussion and having those types of closed-door workshops where you get to some sort of consensus in terms of that piece. I would say, however, sometimes you do have to be directive, and there are things that are just non-negotiable, and this is the way it's going to be done, because otherwise you end up with hybrids. It's like us having 16 different brands. That's not really the most productive way to actually run a business going forward. You do have to be directive.
Very good. So I'm hearing a few themes. You gotta have some checklists and some practices in place. Speed matters. Don't make assumptions. Be open to the fact that the acquired company might have some ideas the acquiring company, just on the off chance, could use and deploy. And you gotta communicate. Right? So those are some big takeaways. We're winding down on time, so I just wanted to say one more time, thank you to the 3 of our panelists on our M&A conversation.